Welcome to the Into Novus Knowledge Agronomy Podcast, your go-to resource for agronomic insights, technology solutions, and ongoing education. At Into, we combine agronomic expertise from soil analysis to best practice application methodologies to provide a holistic view for your yield optimization. Our focus is on practical strategies that improve efficiency and drive better results in the field. Join us for interesting discussions, expert advice, and the latest advancements shaping modern agriculture. Whether you're in the field, on the road, or at your facility, we're here to keep you informed and ahead of the curve. Okay, welcome everyone to the Into podcast. I've got Derek and Rodney with me again. How are you guys doing?
Morning, Nick.
Great.
Guys, if we just want to maybe kick off with how things look in your geography, where we're sitting at crop stage wise, and then we can get into the meat of the conversation. Derek?
So for Northwest Missouri, essentially with corn and beans, all field work is complete at this point, or certainly should be. Our corn is well into, most of it now into that R5.5, to even some of it's probably going to be getting pretty close to black layer here soon. It's changing pretty quick. While we have, I guess the big thing in corn right now is that southern rust and things like that are pretty prevalent in most fields, but so much yield has been set at this point. We're past the point of even trying to do anything for those types of diseases and things. On the soybean side of things, I would still stage most of our beans into that R5 stage. A lot of it's still adding test weight, grain fill period, and things like that. So not to say we're completely out of the window of where stress would have an impact on some of the beans that are out there. But for the most part, our field work should be done in beans as well. And for some of our weed scenarios that still are in our soybeans right now, at this point in time, you're better off waiting for a harvest day desiccation type application because we're so late in those as well. So, but for the most part, things are looking good. Weather's starting to cool down a little bit, which I think has been good for the crop and still getting some periodic rains here and there. And there's going to be a lot of good corn and beans out there. It's just going to be maybe less consistent than we've seen in the past type thing.
Appreciate it, Derek. What about you, Rodney?
Yeah, so a lot of the same things Derek was saying, but I will say 110-degree heat index for a while and then down to 47 degrees the past two mornings has really changed the crop, especially the corn. And so a lot of our corn is in that R5.5 headed to black layer. We are showing some late nitrogen deficiency. We're firing our normal suspects here in this time of year in the fall. We're gonna have variability, like Derek said. 6 weeks ago when we did a podcast, they said, "Man, we've got a bin buster of a crop," and we still have a good crop, but we've taken some hits with all the heat. And then to Derek's point, I can probably find every corn disease you want to find that has come in late. And so to Derek's point, with a lot of the yields already made, and so it's more of a cosmetic. But I'm also noticing up here, we got a lot of stock cannibalization going on. So guys want to be fully aware of that coming into harvest to make sure you're ready to go, because we're one good windstorm from the mess that we don't want to talk about. Switching to soybeans, same as Derek, we're in that R5. We're struggling right along, and up here you got to remember beans are daylight sensitive and temperature sensitive. So now that we've went from hot to cold, now the beans are saying, "Oh shit, I got to get some beans put in these pods because it's fall. It's time to be done." And so we've got a lot of disease rearing its head now in beans too. As you drive at 55 mile an hour down a country road, the color of that bean is changing. And when you stop and look, it's because there's some disease Just about every disease known to man is in the bean crop too. But I think we're far enough along that we're going to be okay. Yield wise, and I'll say it to anybody that'll listen. Um, we won't have the USDA, that big corn crop that USDA says in Illinois. We're going to be variable all over the board. We're going to have a good corn crop, but it's not going to be the best ever.
Appreciate that, guys. I'd be in a real similar boat, so I don't need to belabor it quite as much. But I will say, stage wise on corn, especially, we're probably a little bit ahead of you guys. Yeah, we still have some corn. We wide planting days, so we still have some corn at half milk line. Some of that earlier planted corn is just about to finish off totally. We've got some that's hit black layers, some guys itching to go. A lot of it that's sitting there at our 5.75, 3/4 milk line. So things are progressing along. You guys are right. The southern rust has come in heavy here at the end. Got some tar spot that's really flared up in some places too. That will get worse with this cooler weather. But then the nitrogen loss, you can really see that. You guys were speaking of the variability. We have some places where we have some really significant N loss, and we'll see that when it comes to yield. Soybean side, the earliest planted beans are hitting R6 now. So we still have some at R5, some at R6 now. A lot of SDS, some red crown rot showing up in places. So, and then now to finish things off, August has gotten dry for us after we've been wet all summer. And so we'll see how that drought impacts some of these soybeans too now at the end. With that said, guys, we said last time that we would get into a fall fertilizer discussion. I think this would be a good time to do that. It seems like that's the thing people are starting to flip to in their minds now. And I guess I just get that conversation started with probably the number one thing in the countryside is the comment fertilizer's way too high. And really what they're meaning a lot of times is they're thinking in their minds phosphate's way too high. And it is a lot higher than it has been in the past. It's relatively high compared to the price of corn and soybeans. So I guess, guys, what's your thoughts? And maybe we'll start with you, Derek. How do I handle that? The number one thought on everybody's mind is how do I make this economical, affordable? Like, what place do you start right now, Derek, with us talking about fertilizer prices being higher, really phosphate prices being higher?
Yeah, I think and this isn't just for this year, has really nothing to do with fertilizer prices, but we can't forget about the first basics of any good fertility program, regardless of fertilizer prices, and that would be up-to-date soil samples and soil pH. But those are anytime we talk about a good fertility program, we're going to start with those two. And now I think my key word for this fall is efficiency, and being efficient with what we apply and things like that. And efficiency starts with up-to-date soil samples and adjusting that soil pH. I don't think there's any more valuable information you can have for your farm in terms of fertility than an up-to-date soil sample. Sure, we can always, blind fertilize or fertilize for our crop removal and things like that. But even if we're applying crop removal without an up-to-date soil sample, you still might be wasting money in a certain fertilizer and things like that. And so I'd still start there like we always would. And then as far as pH goes, I deal with plenty of growers that, you mentioned the high phosphate. I deal with plenty of growers that got pretty good levels of phosphorus, but out of our macronutrients or NPK, phosphorus is much more sensitive to pH than say even nitrogen and potassium. You drop much below 6.3 and it's going to start tying up. I deal with guys in river bottoms with high pHs around 7.5. It's going to tie up with calcium. And so there's cases where we do have enough phosphorus in the soil to hit our yield goal, but it's not available because our pH is out of whack, right? And so I would still start there with our up-to-date soil samples and soil pH in any given year. And when we talk about efficiency, those two are going to be pretty key.
And
One thing
Derek, I'll chime in on soil tests. I totally agree with you. And I would challenge our listeners to make sure that soil test, what's it are you up to date in the past 2 years? And the reason I say that, up in our area anyway, we've pulled two huge crops off. And so the soil test, might be 3 years out. I would challenge to have a new soil test taken so we have a new baseline of where we're at. Also, your comment on pH, very well pointed that, your pH may have moved on you. And so we need to get, those are easier things to do to give us a baseline and a roadmap where to go. So, perfect points on make sure you have a soil test so that you can get a map of where you're going to drive this train.
Yeah, you guys hit on it. I mean, to me, soil testing is a very minimal investment for the amount of return that you get on it. And now in a market when things are maybe more expensive, commodity prices down, you need to know where you actually need to apply it. That's a great place to start. On the line piece of it, to Derek's point, I guess I always just like to make sure everybody understands. Just think about phosphorus being utilized in a negative charge. Lots of positive charge things out there that want to tie it up in the soil, like if you're a high pH, calcium, magnesium, or as he points out, at a low pH, which is what we tend to more deal with on our upland soils, you're going to have things like iron and aluminum that want to tie it up. Well, to his point, if we manage pH in the correct realm, we have less of that getting tied up somewhere if it's available. So, yeah, those are great first places to start. Rodney, what else could we potentially do, or how can we help ourselves out now?
So, some other things to think about is placement on the fertilizer. So, if you have the ability to band the fertilizer, put it in the zone that the corn crop and even the beans um, can get the fertilizer. And if you have it, I'm going to go back to soil test again. That tells you what you have. You can reduce 25 to 30% of what you're putting in that band because you are placing it where the crop can get it. And so, Derek hit on efficiencies. There is one big efficiency. Now, I understand that we can't get every acre banded, but there's one place to start. The other thing for efficiency is sulfur. We've talked about pH tying things up, but sulfur is a good conduit that helps phosphorus move also. So we can use sulfur make sure we get sulfur in our, even if we're broadcasting, to help the efficiency of the phosphorus. And also, not just maybe this may be a time you look at variable rate or you look at, random placement, because with a good soil test, it's going to tell you that some areas I don't need to maybe put as much or any, and other places need maybe a little more. So use technology that we have that maybe you've been putting off or thought maybe that I didn't want to spend that money. This is probably the year they need to be looking at some of those tools that we have of where to put that fertilizer. And maybe it's time to not always put the same thing you've always done.
Yeah, those are good points, Rodney. On the banding piece of it, I like to tell folks, one reason why that's also more efficient is just because you decrease the amount of surface area that calcium, magnesium, or iron and aluminum can tie up on that phosphorus. So that's one way that it makes them more efficient. There's all kinds of different data out there that you can look at that will show, to Rodney's point, just the efficiency aid on the phosphorus. One thing I do like to point out too is if you're someone that's surface banding, and maybe not big in your guys' geography, but in mine, it's a little more popular to surface band nitrogen, sulfur. If you have that ability, there is some data out there from North Dakota that shows, a surface band of phosphorus is almost just the same yield as what they saw with a 2x2 band. So while, I mean, obviously putting in the soil would be the way we prefer it, you still can get a lot of good from a surface band. So there's a lot of potential ways that you can do it. I'd also like to hit too, just on another thing that comes to mind is, okay, well, could I just reduce the amount of phosphorus that I put down? If prices are a little bit high, what could I do? And that's one potential thing that we could do. But to your guys' point, number one, we have to have a soil test to even know where we're at. And so while someone that has a really high IP level might be able to implement a potential reduction to the amount of phosphorus they put down, someone with a really low soil test may actually cost themselves more. And the other thing I like to point out too is just what's the future cost, the future opportunity, and the future costs that you may incur if you decide to reduce it. I think if you have high soil test levels, you can reduce it and probably not see a lot of impact. But if you're on the lower side, what's that fertilizer going to cost in the future? And man, it is a exponential number. When you have to build it, it gets really low, and then you have to build it back up. It takes a lot more to build it per part per million P1 than when you maintain it at a higher level. So just a few things to think about. It's not just a kind of 1 year decision. Rodney brings up on the potassium and the sulfur piece of it. And I guess I'd kick it over to you, Derek, too. I mean, I think there's several things that we can add there. I think you make some good points, but what's your thought process if, let's say, I decide to reduce phosphorus? What's maybe some potential other things I could fill that budget with?
Yeah, no. Well, you mentioned both potassium and sulfur, and Rodney already kind of hit on the sulfur and alluded to this a little bit, but sulfur, you know, I guess sulfur's gained some popularity, I would say, over the last few years, especially in soybeans, as it was, I'd say, more common in corn and things like that. But one thing to remember is while the crop needs a certain amount of sulfur per bushel and things like that, sulfur kind of plays with everything in the soil. And by that I mean it will bind to other nutrients and things like that. It makes them more efficient. It can, we hear about the nitrogen to sulfur ratio, and it can make nitrogen more efficient. Well, the same can be said about phosphorus and things like that, potassium as well. Um, Sulfur will make our other nutrients more efficient, as long as we have plenty of it available in the soil. Um, and then on the potassium piece, both crops, and especially even soybeans, and I think this is where we a lot of times fall short with potassium is more in soybeans. And so while potash is still a fairly good buy out there relative to, say, especially like phosphorus, this could definitely be a year, to double down on that nutrient and make sure we have plenty of that, because I do think, especially in soybeans, potassium is one that continues to hold us back as well.
Something I will say too, good comments, Derek. A lot of people say, why you guys keep talking sulfur, sulfur, sulfur? Well, you got to remember, we don't get any free sulfur from Mother Nature anymore. We don't get sulfur out of the air and the atmosphere because of clean, clean air, finger quotes. And so therefore, we have to put sulfur every year because believe it or not, the corn and beans crop use a lot more sulfur than we ever imagined because we always had free sulfur in the air and it was always getting what it needed. Now we have to supplement. The other thing, and Derek hit on it, I don't want to say we're being hard on phosphorus because it's a price situation. Don't forget all the other elemental fertilizers, and Derek mentioned potash, and there's zinc. There's other things when you get a good soil test and that you can be doing with that fertilizer budget that a farmer has given you to where you can get nutrients. Maybe you haven't been doing some things with sulfur and potash and zinc and boron and all of them. This is the year you probably need to start thinking about that and moving budget money from maybe not as much phosphorus to some of these other elementals that will help you in the end that in the past you haven't been able to do.
But Rodney, that goes back to our very first point. We don't know if you're short on those others unless you have a soil test.
Yeah.
So,
So we have a soil test. Common theme here, guys, soil test.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah, really cheap investment for a big ROI potentially. Yeah, you guys hit on it with the potassium and sulfur. I'll just say that I've mentioned this to my group before, but over the last 7-8 years, looking at soil tests, it seems like we have built up our P levels, but our potassium levels we've struggled to keep up. And I think a lot of that is just from the amount of potassium that both crops suck up, and soybeans remove a lot more per bushel off the field in the grain, but corn actually sucks up a ton of potash into the plant material, eventually cycles it back. which is something we could talk about next time. How do we cycle it back faster? But we struggled to keep up. And this might be a year, if you got good P levels, that you could really double down on potassium. And then you guys have hit on it with sulfur. I don't need to say a whole lot other than, man, there is a lot of sulfur deficiency, especially in soybeans this year with all the rain that we've had. And it just shows you that nutrient, we don't have enough of that nutrient out there, and we need to be making applications for that nutrient.
And I'll challenge some of my listeners that we went through the soybean uglies for a long time this spring, and that was purely because sulfur wasn't available. The soil hadn't warmed up yet to mineralize sulfur. Therefore, we stayed in the uglies for a long time. Once the sulfur was mineralizing and ability to take it up in the plant, we took off. So we need to pay conscious effort towards sulfur in moving forward.
Yeah, great point, Rodney. You can really tell this spring, especially the guys that planted beans early and who had AMS in their program or ATS early and who didn't. Just gets those beans off quicker to a faster start. With that said, guys, yeah, I appreciate that. I think fall fertilizer. Next time, I think it'll be great transition into discussing fall herbicide applications after we've kind of done this. So join us next time as we discuss that. Thanks again for listening, guys, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you for joining us. This podcast is brought to you by Into Novus Knowledge. Please reach out to your Into agronomist if we can help in any way. Join us next time for more in-depth agronomic advice.